Why does anything exist at all? There are atoms, cars, cats, you. Virtually everything we encounter in ordinary experience can, apparently, fail to exist. Cars, iPads, iPhones, houses. None of these things have to exist, it seems. We can easily imagine a universe without such things. And there was a time before anything of this sort existed. It seems the things we interact with are contingent, a word we will soon define. Is everything contingent? Or is there something necessary? Again, a term we will explore later. Why not instead just nothing at all? The purpose of this series is to help you investigate a possible answer. There will be 2 stages. Stage 1 examines reality to see if there's anything foundational to reality. And stage 2 examines what this foundational reality could be and what the best hypothesis is. Before we begin, we must go over some basic modal concepts. A contingent fact is something that can fail to exist, cease to exist, or could have been different. For example, a car. By contrast, a necessary thing is something that cannot not exist. Now, I'm hesitant about giving an example because all examples of something necessary will be up for debate. So keeping that in mind, a necessary fact could be that 2 plus 2 equals 4, since it is logically impossible that 2 plus 2 equals anything else. Notice here the language may change, but that isn't what is in view. 2 only refers to a quantitative amount. Let's take a deeper look at what's going on when we make this distinction between contingent and necessary. We are invoking modal terms here. Modal reasoning, which is a branch of reasoning that evaluates claims about possibility, impossibility, contingency, and necessity. We can assess these things using possible world semantics. A possible world is a description of the way reality could have been. When talking about possible worlds, it's important to recognize this is not some sort of multiverse theory. We are merely saying that it is possible that reality could have been different. So possible worlds help us visualize these modal claims, such as, this car is contingent. If the car is contingent, it could not exist or fail to exist or be different. In other words, there are possible worlds in which the car doesn't exist or is different. By contrast, something like mathematical principles would exist in all possible worlds. With that out of the way, let's go into a brief history of the argument. There is a large history behind the contingency argument. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on cosmological arguments, Arabic philosophers such as Ibn Sina developed the argument from contingency, which was taken up by Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. Then thinkers like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Samuel Clarke reaffirmed the cosmological argument, and this class of argumentation is still used today. With such a broad history, there are many variations of the argument proposed, and here we will cover just one of many. Now, in terms of structure, this is a deductive argument, which means if we affirm the premises, the conclusion logically follows and is inescapable. With that being said, here is the structure of the argument. Premise 1, something exists. 2, if everything is contingent, then there is no external explanation of the contingent things. Premise 3, there is an external explanation of the contingent things. Premise 4, therefore, not everything is contingent. 5, therefore, something is non-contingent. And 6, therefore, something has a necessary existence. So let's examine the premises. Premise 1 seems pretty self-evident, but let's still talk about it. By exists, I do not mean anything fancy. I mean that there are things, whatever they might be. Even if everything is an illusion, then illusions exist. Why believe anything exists? Here's why. You can see that something exists via your direct awareness of existing things. For example, you are aware of your thoughts. Your awareness of your thoughts is your clearest way of knowing that your thoughts exist. If we suppose instead that nothing exists, then no one exists. If no one exists, then there is no one for me to convince. There are no words here, there are no thoughts, there is no you. But there are words, there are thoughts, and there is you. Therefore, something exists. Now, why would I start with something so obvious? I would argue that the obvious things are sometimes some of the most important things. How can we reason without first knowing things? And how can we know more things without first knowing some things? We can't even ask, why do I exist, without first noting that we exist. If we want to ask why we exist, we need to acknowledge that we exist before we find the explanation of our existence. Next, consider premise 2. If everything has contingent existence, then there is no external explanation of the contingent things. So let's first discuss what it means to explain a thing's existence. By explanation, we just mean anything that makes sense of the object's existence. This could be a single cause, whether deterministic, indeterministic, agential, and so on. Things we normally experience in life have explanations external to themselves. Back to our car example. The explanation of the car is not completely within the car. That is to say that while the matter the car contains gives a partial explanation to the car, there's still something missing when we try to account for the complete explanation of the car. The agents that produce the car are not part of the car. Those agents transcend the car. All objects we experience are like this. They have an explanation for their existence, and that explanation transcends their existence. A contingent thing is something that doesn't have necessary existence. So the premise says that if nothing has necessary existence, then there is no external explanation of the fact that there are contingent things that there are. And so too follows from the intended meaning of explanation, which goes beyond what is to be explained. In this case, what is to be explained is the fact that there are contingent things that there are. If we want to know why there are these contingent things, an external explanation will not be entirely in terms of those very same things. Any explanation in terms of contingent things presupposes the very thing we are trying to explain, these very contingent things. So an external explanation of the contingent things, of the fact that they all exist, will ultimately be in terms of something that is not contingent. And this inference doesn't depend on the length of the chain of contingent things, and we will cover more on this later. It's also worth noting the term the contingent things refers to the plural of all contingent things at all times and all places. In referring to the contingent things, I do not assume that they compose a single big contingent thing, over and above the individuals. In the same way, by referring to 10 children, I'm not saying those 10 children compose a big child. Next, let's turn to premise 3. This is the engine of the argument. This is where I will propose a basic principle of reality that will serve us in our quest, the principle of explanation. This principle tells us that if an explanation of something is even possible, that we should expect there to be one and explore it. More formally, for any fact f, if an explanation is possible, then an explanation of f is expectable, other things being equal. Other things being equal here just means that this principle applies everywhere where the circumstances stay the same. This principle is relatively modest as far as principles of explanation go. PE is more modest than the classic principle of sufficient reason, which is the explanatory principle typically used in some sort of contingency argument like this. The PSR says that everything whatsoever has a sufficient reason or an explanation or a cause. By contrast, PE doesn't require that much. Instead, PE expresses a presumption to expect an explanation. In other words, explain as much as you can. Why should we accept this? First, I think it's important to clarify what I mean when I say some explanation is expectable. What I do not mean is that the explanation is automatically self-evident. We still need to discover what the explanation is. I simply state that we should expect there to be one. Much like if I gave you a crazy math equation that you lack the skills to find the answer to, you at least expect there to be an answer. Just because the answer isn't self-evident doesn't mean we assume it isn't there. Just like the math equation, if we don't automatically know the explanation of something, we should still reasonably expect it to have one. Another note on this point of what I mean by expectable is that we merely have a probability-based expectation, what some philosophers call epistemic probability. For example, if I roll a die, I have a 1/6 expectation that I'll roll a 2. All of our experiences lend themselves to the idea that things have an explanation. Think about it this way. You just bought your dream car, you saved up for years so you could afford it. You just got off the car lot and went to the grocery store. You go in, grab your groceries, and when you come out, you notice a giant dent in your bumper. What does your intuition tell you? that the dent happened without explanation? Or is it because someone wasn't paying attention, hit your car, and drove off? I would venture to guess you're expecting the latter option to be true over the former. Why? Because all of your previous experiences have built an anticipation that things have an explanation. Why? Because they all had one. Next, another line of reasoning I would offer, a lack of experience of things that have no explanation. It appears we don't have experience with things popping into existence without explanation. I'm willing to bet that, probably most of your life, you are never watching out in case an anvil pops into existence without explanation over your head and crushing you. Why? Because your previous experiences tell you that things like that don't happen. Why? Because you have experiences where things have an explanation and don't have experiences where things don't have an explanation. One last thing I would like to offer is more of a consequence of denying this principle, and that is the cost of undermining our scientific knowledge. Now, I'm not saying you have to believe this principle to have scientific knowledge. Rather, what I am saying is that if this principle isn't true, we would not be able to do science. All of science is observing the natural world and how it interacts, searching for explanations of why things act the way they do, why element X reacts the way it does when exposed to Y. Without the expectation of an explanation, how would we ever run such experiments? The ramifications go beyond science. Without PE, it seems unclear how we would infer the external world is real. It seems unclear how we would even know the past is real. If this principle of explanation is false, what's saying our own consciousness didn't pop into existence without explanation 5 minutes ago? In a world where this principle was not true, it seems like we would have to be skeptical about everything. For suppose there is no presumption to expect an explanation, then why expect any external explanation of your existence or inner experiences? You might just as likely be randomly hallucinating. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting that you must first explicitly believe PE to believe that particular things have an explanation. Rather, I think you can begin by directly witnessing clear cases of explanations, such as that your current thoughts have an explanation in terms of previous thoughts. These clear cases then provide a basis for inferring a more general principle, which is implicit in ordinary and scientific reasoning. Here is a final reason-based consideration that may also support PE. One may have a direct, intuitive sense that truths, in general, have an explanation. To trigger that sense, take any arbitrary proposition, P, out of a hat. Suppose P is true. We can wonder, why is P true? Why not false? One's very curiosity reflects the sense that there is likely some explanation, whatever it might be. At this point, it may help to sketch the sorts of explanations that might be available in general. So take any true proposition P. Proposition P is either contingent or necessary. Suppose first, P is contingent. Then an explanation of P could be in terms of prior causes or tendencies. For example, the fact that there are dogs is explicable in terms of a causal history leading to the first dog. Next, suppose P is necessary. In that case, here are the three options. 1. The fact that P is necessary is a reason to think P cannot have an explanation. 2. P has an explanation in terms of more fundamental, necessary truths. Or 3. P is self-explanatory or explained by the fact that it is necessary. Before moving on, I want to emphasize again that PE is quite modest. The principle merely invites us to seek an explanation as far as we can. If there is an exception, then perhaps that fact is special. We can identify special exceptions if we have sufficient reason. In any case, PE is at least a reason in support of premise 3, which one may weigh in the balance. Moreover, in the absence of counterbalancing reason to think that a given fact admits of no further explanation, one has no reason to treat the given fact as different from every other fact that has a further explanation. In other words, you may explain facts as far as you can. As a brief recap of the argument, the key idea is that contingent things have some explanation. To avoid circularity, an explanation of all the contingent things will not be solely in terms of contingent things. If that is right, then some non-contingent thing is part of the total explanation of contingent things. Since a non-contingent thing is a necessary thing, it follows that there is a necessary thing. Maybe there are many necessary things, but there is at least one. It's time to test whether or not our reasoning is successful, and these tests will come in the form of objections. Objections are useful because they can shed light on issues that need elucidation and open our eyes to something we couldn't see before. Objection number 1, infinite regress. The argument assumes that the chain of explanations must be finite. It's possible that the chain is infinite. If it is the case that the chain of explanations is infinite, then there doesn't need to be something necessary. In reply, I think this objection is helpful in clarifying what the argument is doing and what it's not doing. Note first that this objection does not target any premise in the argument. In the argument, I leave open the prospect of an infinite chain of causes. No premise says that the contingent reality is finite. The principles in this argument have nothing at all to do with the length or history or the size of reality. Maybe reality is infinitely old. Maybe it's finite. Maybe there is one universe, maybe there is a multiverse. No matter the size or age, we can ask how any reality of any length or size could exist. The argument is saying that without a foundation, there would be nothing, ever. The foundation is not something that comes before the chain of causes. Rather, the foundation is the ultimate basis of everything across all time. So the hypothesis that there is an infinite chain leaves unanswered why that particular chain exists. The infinitude of the chain still leaves open something that's unexplained. To illustrate, philosopher Dr. Joshua Rasmussen proposes this story. Suppose you find a hammer in your friend's garage, and you ask, "Where did this hammer come from?" Your friend replies, "Oh, that hammer has always been there." His answer doesn't really address your question, since the age of the hammer, even if infinite, doesn't by itself ultimately explain the existence of the hammer. So this argument leaves open whether or not there is an infinite chain of contingent things, because the amount of contingent things cannot build necessity. Objection 2, the fallacy of composition. It is fallacious to suppose that the totality of contingent things is itself contingent. After all, a totality can have different properties from its parts. For example, a sandwich is made up of partly tomato, but it doesn't follow that the whole sandwich is tomatoes. Similarly, maybe each contingent thing has an explanation, while the totality of contingent things has no explanation. In reply, this argument does not depend upon any inference from parts to wholes. Our explanatory principle applies to totalities no matter the size. Again, Dr. Joshua Rasmussen proposes a story to illustrate this, and here it is. You wake up in an alternative world. In this world, you encounter a forest on a flat planet that extends out infinitely. You then overhear some people talking about the origin of the forest. Their conversation proceeds like so. Philo says, "Where did this forest come from?" His friend Nihilo says, "Don't you know? Every tree in the forest came from another tree. This forest is infinite." Philo responds, "I've heard that, Nihilo, but I'm still perplexed. Why have any trees ever come from any other trees? Why are there any trees here at all? And why these trees?" Nihilo responds, "Explaining each tree suffices to explain all the trees. What is there left to explain?" Philo then says, "There's something left unexplained. I see this giant forest. It's huge and impressive. But why is it here? Why not instead an infinite series of vines or turtles or just nothing at all? If you explain a bunch of things by citing the activities of those same things, then the explanation is circular. A circular explanation is as good as no explanation." Nihilo says, "Well, the reason no vines are here is that these trees here take up too much space." Suddenly, out of nowhere, a new infinite forest appears in the sky. Philo and Nihilo run and hide. The end. The story is supposed to illustrate the difference between explaining individual things, in this instance trees, and explaining groups, in this instance the forest. Even if each individual tree is somehow explained in terms of another tree, all these individual explanations leave something unexplained. We can still wonder why there is an infinite forest at all, or why it exists where it does. PE invites us to search for an explanation that goes beyond the very fact to be explained. So if there is a forest, PE invites an explanation that goes beyond the elements of that same forest. In general, an external explanation of X, whether one or many, is in terms of something beyond X itself. Objection 3. Virtual particles. We have evidence that things can appear without any cause or explanation. For example, physicists tell us that virtual particles can randomly appear without any cause at all. In reply, the first thing to note is that virtual particles don't literally come from nothing. Virtual particles come from prior states of energy. Next, states of energy can provide a non-deterministic explanation. For example, if state alpha spontaneously transitions to state beta, and if state alpha had a 15% chance of doing so, then this 15% chance provides some explanation of the transition. For the purposes of our arguments, even a slight explanation counts as some explanation. Objection 4. The bootstrapping objection. How could a foundation produce anything? The foundation has a necessary nature, while its effects do not. So how can a necessary nature give rise to things that lack a necessary nature? In reply, this objection helps us separate different versions of the argument from contingency. Some versions rely on the stronger principle that whatever is contingent must have a prior cause. By contrast, I don't rely on anything that strong. Instead, I say, explain as much as you can. We can explain dogs and turtles, for example, in terms of prior activities, thus we can expect an explanation of dogs and turtles. Same for contingent things. We can explain them in terms of prior activities. Moreover, the activities themselves could also have an explanation in terms of a necessary tendency within the necessary thing to non-deterministically produce something. Here's the main point. If we explain things as far as we can, that's enough to expose a reason to think contingent things have an explanation in terms of a necessary thing. Objection 5. Brute facts. Everyone is committed to brute, unexplained facts. Whether you locate bruteness in God or in the universe, something must be ultimate. So why couldn't the universe be brute, ultimate reality? For those unaware, a brute fact is anything that cannot be explained by a deeper, more fundamental fact. With that being said, this objection does not touch this stage of the argument. Remember, this first stage leaves open what the necessary foundation of reality is. We have only argued so far that reality has a necessary foundation, so this is an objection we will cover in the second stage. In conclusion, there could be a lot more said here, but we have arrived at our first destination. We've argued that there is a necessary foundation to reality. We then tested this hypothesis through different objections that actually helped clarify our concepts, and rather than destroying our path, they helped us probe the integrity of the principles that got us here. Reality has some sort of fundamental foundation that is necessary. You may still have questions, and that's to be expected. Continue to test this. Test everything. Be skeptical, cautious, and careful. It is the way to see more. What else can we do from here? In the next entry, we will consider the second stage of this argument, bridging the gap from necessary foundation to God. In this second stage, we will cover why the best explanation of this necessary foundation is the God hypothesis.